What you're looking at is the number of papers published per year in my area of research, machine learning and natural language processing. I'm going to tell you about how the shape of this curve, this growth in publications over the past few years has really changed me in an odd way in how I look at life. I've been hearing a lot of you talk about, depression, not feeling motivated, and just an overall failure to sort of flourish or thrive. And I thought I would share with you one of my life experiences from the past few years, and hopefully that will help you. I'm going to throw out the disclaimer, I'm not a psychologist or counselor or anything like that, but the experiences I've had in the past few years has really, it's helped me overcome these issues. And so I feel like I have a little bit of the antidote. I feel sort of obligated to tell you about it, but take it for what it's worth. So, just a little bit of history about me. I'm going to start just mentioning college. I was a pretty good student. I succeeded. But I had to put in work. The work wasn't too difficult, in the sense that, I had hit problems, but I just knew if I invested a little more time, studied a little bit harder, the problems would go away, right? I was able to, continue to succeed doing this. I never felt like I was ever really stuck. Now, later in my life, I went to grad school and started working on my PhD. The first period of grad school, of doing a PhD, always involves more study, more courses. Just like in college, you take a few more classes. They're a bit harder and faster pace. Again, I was able to sort of double down, on my efforts, and I did fine there, and I didn't really ever feel stuck at all. And I thought, okay, well, it'll just be a matter of time. I'll finish up this PhD, no problem. I'll be really quick about it. I'll succeed. Who knows what's ahead of me, but this is going to be awesome. And I started to get into research, and that's why I'm showing you this graph. This is by a man named Merrick Ray. Just want to give him a little credit there. It's a really nice visualization. And for a PhD, you need to publish. That means you need to get other people, other researchers to look at your work anonymously, critique it, and it needs to pass that critique for it to be accepted and then published. I picked these fields of machine learning, which is and natural language processing, which are sort of deeply intertwined at this point, because it's very interesting. It involves understanding the meaning of words, and it has lots of sort of direct applications to the real problems people want solved. As a consequence, there's a lot of interest. There are big companies like Google and Facebook who are actively publishing in this area. So that means there's, professional teams out there, and all they do is just research and then make new things and then publish on it. And they're very good at this. The plus side of all this interest in the field is it's very exciting. There's a lot of new things happening. The field's not stagnant at all. There's lots of change. There's lots of growth. There's lots of really new cool things coming out of it. But at this point, when I was in the midst of research, because it on one hand, it was fantastic that there's so much cool stuff happening. On the other hand, it felt sort of like felt like I was sprinting on a treadmill. Have you ever seen one of those videos of, you know, some guy, some goofball cranks up the speed on a treadmill to max and tries to sprint, and then inevitably runs out of, energy and just or trips or something and falls and hits the treadmill and gets rocketed off the back and hits the wall or something? That was sort of how I was feeling right before I tripped. I had a plan. I had started working on this large, complex AI system for understanding these really sort of nuanced relationships in a text. So little nuanced meaning of words and their interaction. And I won't go too deep into that other than there was this big upfront cost in my plan. I'm going to build this system. There's going to be a lot, and by upfront cost, I mean there's a lot of time and effort to make it. But once I finished it, then there was going to be a series of papers I could write about it and a few sort of easier follow-ups where I could just make a few tweaks, adjustments, etc. And all those papers in my plan would then become my PhD thesis, and then I'd be done. And everything would be great. So I spent the better part of a year building this thing, and this is also not just like my crackpot idea. My advisor's fully on board with this. Seems like a great idea. So I spent like the better part of a year just coding like a madman. So I'm spending 12 hours a day at times coding. And I had to learn a lot of things, but I'm making progress. But like I said, there wasn't going to be a payoff for it until I finished, and then I could, then it is kind of like, digging down deep and then hitting some gold vein, and in the side of a mountain, and there's pay dirt, but the whole time you're digging, there's kind of nothing. You're just going through dirt, right? So just about as I was finishing this thing up, I'd say I was about 95% done. Like it was starting to actually work. There's some tweaks and some extensions I was going to add into this thing. Right as it's starting to come to fruition, this curve started to pick up. And what that amounts to is the reason why there's this big spike on this paper as you go to the right. Sort of the category or paradigm, however you want to call it, the sort of framework of all the machine learning tools we were using shifted. A new line of research really began to dominate. It's called deep learning. And a lot of things, including what I had been working on, basically became obsolete. And that means right as I was on the cusp of starting to get some results out of this work, now basically nobody cared. And I kind of finished it up and tried to publish some stuff, but it just wasn't relevant anymore. The newer technology, it's just sort of, broke in and just sort of changed everything. And that was pretty, it was a tough moment, to say the least. Because I had spent years in my PhD up to that point, going through courses, learning about the research, starting the research, now finally building this thing, and now right on the edge of this, my plan's sort of up in smoke. And it's hard to express just how sort of crushing this was to me at the time. And I had a real sense of that my work my work and by extension me just didn't really matter anymore. The thing is, the whole PhD is kind of like that, the problem I was working on. It doesn't really matter till you're done. So I was, in my mind, 90% of the way there, and then I felt like I got kicked back to the beginning, or just about. And that feeling, in combination with the knowledge that there's these very sort of brilliant people working in the field, and they're succeeding, and they're succeeding quickly, and if you look, you go back and look at this graph, 2013, 2014, 2015, it's starting to like pick up, and it just trying to read the papers as they come out and trying to figure out what to do. It's felt like the rate of work being done was increasing. So at the moment when I felt like, when my research was sort of failing, everyone else is sort of taking off. And this is really the first time I felt truly stuck. I felt truly sort of basically without a future. And you think, well, why would you feel like that? Well, I'd basically one choice. Do I keep working on my PhD, or do I quit? Now, if I quit, like I said, 90% of a PhD is just as good as 0% of a PhD. So I could feel like a failure at that, and then that means there's just years of my life gone. That was tough to consider. Also, I had a young child at the time, and I felt like I would be sort of a terrible example. But on the flip side, I could keep working and finish, but I didn't see how that was going to ever work out. I didn't see how I could ever complete it, because not only was my work sort of just evaporated, but now like a different line of technology taken over that I wasn't familiar with at all, and now that's going off at sort of a, it's this having this meteoric rise. It seems it's like the research is moving at an inhuman pace. Like, how could I keep working? Would I just, if I started on something new, would it just be another sort of useless Sisyphean task, right? Like, that's, at that time I became aware of that, Greek mythology of Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill, and then once he gets to the top, it slips out of his hands and rolls back down to the beginning, and that's his eternal punishment. It pretty well sums up how I felt about that, right? When I realized my work was no longer relevant, I basically sat there and watched that boulder of my life roll back down the hill. And I wasn't certain if I started again that it wouldn't be the exact same result. I've heard stories about people falling for scams, like those Nigerian prince scams, where he's like, send me money and I'll pay you back 1,000 times over. Apparently people who get caught in that and do actually send the guy who's not really a Nigerian prince, of course, money, a lot of times they'll just keep sending money to the person. And it sounds insane, but they can't accept they got duped, right? They can't accept that, oh, I've just been had and now I'm missing, thousands of dollars or something. So they just keep sending money thinking, oh yeah, this will eventually pay out. But of course it never does. And that was sort of what I was worried about going forward. So it's like I could either just vanish years of my life on one hand by quitting, or I could keep sort of feeding money into this, this like a lotto machine, or one of those one-armed bandits, that they call them. It's like a coin-fed machine. You keep pulling the lever and nothing comes out. So it was a pretty bleak time for me. And as a result, where you don't feel like you have a path forward, it becomes really hard to stay motivated and keep working. And when your motivation slips and you start messing other things up, then you feel worse about yourself, which in turn kills your motivation further, which makes you feel even worse, which then kills your motivation even more. And it's sort of this downward spiral of, well, things are awful and they're just getting worse. And at that time, I started, I wasn't, well, I was a little vocal about it, unfortunately, but I was really sort of blaming my advisor, the other people in my research group, the field itself. I felt like an idiot. I was even blaming like my wife. And in the midst of it, I just thought, well, I could never be like those researchers at Google who are just crushing it. Like there was a sense that, my work would never really matter. And there's that awful sense, I think a lot of people feel this now, that, everything's amazing except for me. Thankfully, my advisor is a very gracious person, and he said something to me that really started to turn the corner. And he pointed out that, well, yeah, my work was now obsolete. But he said, if, truth of the matter is, let's say my plan had worked and the system had been a success and I had published some stuff off of it, well, that work would still be obsolete in a couple years anyways, because this is the realm of technology and things keep changing. He said, the work doesn't really matter. Like, what you're making never really mattered. It's what matters is what you learn along the way and what sort of changes inside you. And it took me a while to realize, that message. And that there's a sort of, that the whole thing was really sort of, I don't know how to express it, this sort of existential experience where the outcome really didn't matter. It was really about me measuring myself against the wrong standard. And what I mean by that is I was comparing myself to these other researchers, but what I should have been measuring myself against is, a prior version of me, or me before I had started grad school, or me from the year before, the month before. And when I started to look at it that way, it really opened my mind. It made me realize a bunch of things that I hadn't before. And this connects to this parable from the Bible. I'm going to read it to you and tell you how it connects all with this. This is one of my favorite passages. I guess if I do enough video on biblical passages, I'll probably end up saying that about everything. But this one, I really enjoyed it before I think fully understood it. And I'm just going to read it to you and then comment on it. And this is Christ, giving this message as a lesson. He said, "Again, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated as a story of a man going on a long trip. He called together his servants and entrusted his money to them while he was gone. He gave 5 bags of silver to one, 2 bags of silver to another, and 1 bag of silver to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities. Then he left on his trip. The servant who received 5 bags of silver began to invest the money and earned 5 more. The servant with the 2 bags of silver also went to work and earned 2 more. But the servant who received 1 bag of silver dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master returned from his trip and called them to give an account of how they had used his money. The servant to whom he had entrusted the 5 bags of silver came forward with 5 more and said, Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 5 more. The master was full of praise. Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. The servant who had received 2 bags of silver came forward and said, Master, you gave me 2 bags of silver to invest. I have earned 2 more. The master said, Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. Then the master of 1 bag of silver came and said, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, harvesting crops where you did not plant them, and gathering crops you did not cultivate. I was afraid I would lose your money, so I hid it in the earth. Look here. Look, here is your money back. But the master replied, You wicked and lazy servant. If you knew I harvested crops I did not plant and gather crops I did not cultivate, why didn't you deposit my money in the bank? At least I could have gotten some interest on it. Then he ordered, Take the money from this servant, give it to the one with 10 bags of silver. To those who use what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But those who do nothing, even what little they have, will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's a tough message, but it also depends on how you look at it. Now, there's the 3 servants. They're each responsible for producing something with what they're given, and they each have a different amount. But that isn't really the relevant piece. The failure of the last servant's not that he was given 1 to start with. It's that he didn't do anything with it. It's what the implication is. If he had, if the servant with 1 had produced 1 more, everything would be fine. But he didn't. Instead, he blames the master, right? He calls him unfair. He looks at a situation, thinks this is all unfair. According to the parable, the talents or bags of silver were divided up based upon abilities. So it's kind of pointed out that he's the least. That's probably in his mind. So he resents that. He resents the other servants. He resents the master. And he doesn't do anything with it. And he's ultimately led down, he walks down this sort of miserable path. Now, on the other hand, the other 2 servants, the one with 5 and the other with 2, they produce more. And it says the one invested the money and earned more, and the other went to work and earned 2 more. And in both cases, the master gives the exact same response. Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling the small amount, so now I'll give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. There are a few things in here. One, it didn't matter that one had yielded 5 and the other yielded 2. What really matters is that they did something with what they were given. They put in effort, and that ultimately yielded something. It didn't. The master didn't say, for the person with 2 versus the person with 5, well, you did okay. The person with 5 is the one who nailed it. No, he said he has the exact same response, because the benchmark for each one is versus themselves. Also, when he says what he says of both of them is, even to the person with 5, he says, you've been faithful in handling this small amount. So is whatever gift he thinks he has to work with is still sort of trivial in the eyes of the master. It's really nothing in the big picture. Even though he could have sort of gloated about having 5 versus the other having 2 and 1. And then notice also, finally, they're rewarded by being given even more responsibility. And the master says, let's celebrate together. There's actual joy in doing what they're supposed to. Unlike the one servant who buried their talent or their bag of silver, as this translation says. I think, to me, I'm not sure exactly when, in conjunction with talking with my advisor, I realized this, but I became aware of this parable again, and I realized part of it is I realized I was comparing myself versus the wrong standard. I shouldn't be worried about some elite team at Google and what they can produce. I need to worry about me and what I can do with what I've been given. And that there's a lot of work involved as well. And then actually fulfilling this is meaningful and joyful at that. And there's essentially a choice in front of myself, and there's a choice in front of you about, well, you can use what you're given, whether you think that's a lot or little, and you can do something with it, or you can be resentful about it and blame everyone else. Now, and as the parable points out, the first leads to joy, while the second leads to misery. So it doesn't really matter if you think, and this is where I think the parable is different from or one of the differences between life and this parable is, we don't really know if we're the servant with 5, 2, or 1, and it also doesn't really matter. You just need to use what you're given. And to me, that's actually incredibly sort of hopeful and encouraging. Now, also, I'll comment, I think this parable points to some truism a lot of others have realized as well. In Aristotle's Ethics, he says essentially the sort of value or meaning in life is to realize your own potential and act on it. I think that meshes almost perfectly with what this is saying. You need to realize what you have, and you need to use it. And that's what, God expects from you. I would also like I think there's another story that's actually quite similar, though people don't usually think of it this way, and I'm going to jump over to this. So it's just that this is Matthew 25. Matthew 26, it's Christ in Gethsemane. The context here is that, Christ has returned to Jerusalem. He knows he's going to be crucified. But it hasn't. That downward spiral hasn't started yet, in some sense, or those, let's say, tragic events haven't started yet. But it starts off with him going to Gethsemane. So let me read just a few verses of this. Then Jesus went with them to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here while I go over to pray." He took Peter and Zebedee's 2 sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. He told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch over me." He went on a little further and bowed his face to the ground, praying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." I think Christ is here. Now he's talking the cup of suffering. He realizes this is his own death. He realizes this is taking on, the sin of all humanity. And this is sort of a terrible burden to bear, to say the least, I guess. And he is also facing the same sort of choice. So in the parable of the bags of silver or talents or whatever you want to call it, each person's given something to do something with. Bags of silver, they need to produce something. That is their sort of as they're calling their potential, if you will, to use Aristotle's languages. Here, Christ's potential is sort of the highest example of this, the redemption of all humanity. Now, he too faces the same choice. He doesn't want to walk down that path, right? He says, "Let this cup of suffering be taken from me." That is him saying, "I don't want to do it. Yet, I want your will to be done, not mine." I think there, again, is the same idea of the calling of each individual, the servants in the one story and Christ in this, what they need, what they're sort of destined to do or obligated to do or responsible for versus the easier road, right? And here, thankfully, Christ then goes on and accepts his responsibility. Now, in the parable of the servants, it's joyous, for those who follow through with what they've been given. And for Christ's case, it is ultimately joyous as well, but there's a terrible path between where he is and that final glory. And I'd also want to point out that, in this little passage, Christ is here, he's asking them to pray and watch over him, and he's pointing out how much anguish he's in. But you could think from the outside, he's praying to God, he's sort of mentally suffering. But from the outside looking at him, it's just a guy in an olive grove sort of muttering to himself in some sense. Often, I think some of the most sort of difficult burdens or responsibilities we have to bear are really in our mind. From the outside, they don't really look at like anything. Just like, and to me, that's how I relate it back to me. My story is, well, I was sort of suffering on the inside. It wasn't almost at all apparent on the outside there was anything wrong. And I think that's sort of a pattern that people are suffering from, difficult circumstances. It's often the case. It doesn't look like there's much going on when there's actually a lot happening on the inside. And just tying and going back to Jesus here in Gethsemane, his sort of anguish and misery is so severe by the end of the story, right? That he even, Christ is the Son of God, as G.K. Chesterton points out, that even the Son of God thinks God has abandoned him when it finally culminates with this crucifixion and cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So the burden can be pretty great. The burden that, God asks us to carry. But remember, in all the stories here, the outcome on the other side is in fact joyous. And I think this, as I understand it, both these stories taken together are, let's say, reflections of Christ's command that if you want to be my disciple, you have to take up your cross daily and follow me. I think both of these stories point to, well, what is that cross? And this sort of begins to flesh it out, right? It's these responsibilities, these things, positive and difficult, which are often intertwined somehow, given to us by God to do. These potentials to realize, these responsibilities to bear. This is, in my sort of view, the kind of basically the crux of Christian belief. Now, how's my story, end? I realized through talking with my advisor, through reading scripture, through listening to some good teachers, that maybe my situation wasn't as dire. As bad as it felt, I could do something. And I realized I had been given quite a bit. I had learned quite a bit since I had started grad school. I was mostly in a sort of state of self-pity. And even though I had spent so much time building something that didn't matter, along the way I'd actually acquired a lot of skills, and I also acquired quite a bit of discipline. The discipline to sit there and code for days and days and days on end for very long periods of time. And I realized also I wasn't fully being honest with myself. I was sort of discounting what I had been given as overly critical, sort of lashing out like the servant with one talent in that story. And I listened to my advisor some more. I ended up taking some different courses, and I reinvented my skills. And I had this fear, I think this was ultimately part of it too, is I thought I wasn't capable enough to adapt and change, but that was really in my head. And I was able to learn a whole new set of things very quickly. In fact, what I had learned before that was useless. It taught me something about how to learn in general, and I was able to pick up this whole new skill set. I turned out liking it a lot more. I'm actually sort of glad this whole thing happened. I was able to publish some work off of this, and I was able to finish my dissertation and finally graduate. In the end, I can't say that I'm, an amazing researcher like those elite teams at, Ivy League schools and at Google and etc. I'm not like them, but I am a better version of me. I think I was able to wake up a little bit, realize some of my potential and act on it. Just as the parable points to, just as, Aristotle points out. And in the end, I'm actually thankful for this experience. I'm actually happy even for the worst part of it, because now that I'm on the other side of it, the whole thing taught me something about being resilient, about having some hope, about having really sort of faith in the whole process. One thing I didn't really mention is when I started grad school, I really felt sort of called to go. And then while I was in the sort of the bottom of it, I mean, by called, I meant sort of called by God, like God wanted me to go to grad school. And then when I was in the sort of the pit of it, I really doubted the whole thing. I thought, well, maybe this is something I wanted to do, and I was just making believe that I had felt called. But I think for me, part of that sort of bad experience in a way was actually something I needed to go through. And it really changed how I look at myself and who I think I am. And I'm even still thankful for how miserable I felt at times. Because having come through it on the other side has really sort of reshaped me. I like the metaphor of going on a hike, that when you go on a hike, you don't really enjoy it that much while you're doing it. I mean, sometimes you do, at least parts of it, but then there are other parts where you get tired, you get thirsty, you get hungry, your leg hurts, your friend's talking too much, won't shut up, it doesn't seem like you're ever going to make it to the destination, and then you do, And then a week later, despite how sort of rough the experience was at times, you think, well, I'm really glad I did that. So I try to keep that sort of perspective that when times sort of get tough, that there's often a lot to be learned there, and getting through those experiences can teach you a whole lot. It can actually sort of reshape who you are to a degree, and it's on the flip side, it's almost never the sort of easy experiences that do that. So I like to compare going on a hike to eating Cheetos and watching Netflix. That's never going to be a special time in your life. It's fun in the moment, but it's a week later you're not thankful you did it. So some amount of difficulty, suffering, anguish with the right sort of frame of mind is worth it. I recently listened to a podcast, or maybe it was in a book, by this guy named Jocko Willink. He's a former Navy SEAL, and he was talking about his time in battle and war in Iraq, and he said the war is basically hell on earth, but at the same time is the best time in his life. And it was for the same reasons, that this sort of, sometimes these really awful experiences that are awful in the moment can actually be constructive towards who you are. And then I'd just like to follow up with a few comments on, like, well, how can, if you're in the middle of some situation where when you're feeling sort of crushed and hopeless, what can you actually do? I think the main thing from both the passages of Scripture is you need to take responsibility, basically, for your life, for your choices and how you respond. You can't control, just like the servants, you can't control how many talents you've been given. You probably don't even know how many talents you've been given, but you can choose how you're going to respond, what you're going to do with them. Also, ask for help. The turning point in the story for me was when I asked my advisor, when I asked him for help, when I asked him for direction, when I asked him for some counseling. He helped me see my experience through different lens, and that sort of tipped a chain of events that sort of turned my spiral down to a spiral up. And I think the next point is to be honest with yourself, and you don't want to overestimate your problems. What I mean by that is there's sometimes you're in a bad spot because you failed to do what you need to do, and you need to be honest about yourself and assess that and change. And then sometimes you can underestimate your problems. So what I mean by that is, well, I've heard people say, oh, I'm struggling, but part of me thinks that what I'm struggling about doesn't really matter or isn't really important. And that was also a sort of a dimension of my issue too, is I felt like I was sort of struggling with finishing, and there's a lot of anguish about that for me. But at the same time, I didn't feel like I could go to anyone and say, well, I'm sort of miserable, I don't think I can finish my PhD. It seems like kind of almost the ultimate first world problem. It's like, boo-hoo, this guy can't get an advanced degree. So what? But the thing is, if something's deeply bothering you, then it matters. It doesn't matter if it seems trivial to the outside or not. You shouldn't minimize your own problems to that point. You should address them. And the next point is, I like to think of as small victories. Another way of saying that is just discipline. Other parts of the story I didn't mention that helped me sort of correct and get back on the right path is I started, exercising a lot. I kind of overdid it. I still have pulled muscle in my back from it, but I did that, which, it also relieves a sort of physical anxiety. And I did a lot of research. I read a lot. I made sure to read a ton of papers. I put in the work I know I needed to do to catch up in this new field. I've reproduced a lot of people's work. So I just, the point here is these things like, reading some material, going to the gym, cleaning up your room, basically this is a way of saying you need to add discipline to your life. It's a way of saying there's these small objective things you can do to be sure that each day you've improved. That's actually what I got out of a lot of that. I read a lot of papers that weren't even relevant, but it's hard to tell ahead of time if they are or aren't going to be something I'll base your work on. And you think, well, if you're trying to finish a PhD, what good is it to go work out? There's something psychologically important about making, some objective improvement in your own life, so you can think, well, at least today, at the very least, I'm a little more healthy, or at least I know about one more thing. And that will keep your hopes up. And also, by reading enough, for me, then I eventually discovered, oh, this is what I want to, base my work upon. Oh, there's some problems here I can solve. You'll, seemingly by putting in a lot of work, you'll by chance, and I don't think it's really by chance, find what you need to do. And then finally, I think you need to remind yourself of your ideal or your sort of potential, the talents, if you will, in that story. And you got to think about who do you really want to be and who do you really sort of want to become. And as Aristotle said again, you need to realize that potential and act on it and not discount it and not compare yourself to others. It's not really how you stack up versus others, just does not matter at all. I think, again, if this is the only thing you get, that the real metric of comparison is, you from yesterday. And if you're better than that person, then you're going to be okay. Really at the core of my sort of personal life philosophy now, one of the thoughts that I carry around in my head all the time is that I can and I should become a better version of myself. And that basically summarizes my thoughts on all this. Hopefully that's helpful to you. Please reach out if you need someone to talk to. Thanks for listening.